Good morning, everyone. Or if it might be somewhere else, could be good afternoon or good evening. Never gets old to do that intro in many different ways, but it's going to be a different kind of video today. It's going to be purely a mechanical analysis. And this is going to be a bit strange for a lot of people, considering that when you talk about coaching, when you talk about reviewing League of Legends theory, most of the things that people talk about are things that coaches directly interact with, which may be draft, which is a big one. You have the idea of like team macro, where people make decisions in game that coaches should be able to iron out, which is the idea of, okay, maybe it's like lane allocation or things like that, where people are going, how they play certain team fights as a whole, like whether they understand if they're supposed to funnel the enemy into them through, vision control, if they're supposed to hard engage off of, some wave state. But these are all macro ideas that are kind of easy to teach in terms of a coaching perspective, because it's just if the players know the theory, then ideally they should be doing it. But there's something that I rarely hear addressed and super important, and we might do like further series on it, which is the idea that the professional players at the world level seem to not be mechanically sound, even though it should be noted that it's on stage and they might be nervous, which is something that I struggle with on my own as a player. It's not really an acceptable excuse considering how much they play and have experience on the pro stage, especially for the rookies, or people that, I should say, are not rookies. So with that being said, I just want to show this clip from C9 versus DFM, where the mechanical discipline of the players is just completely lacking, and mostly in the placement of the cursor and also just team fight decision making. So right here, you can see C9's composition is a pretty classic poke comp, a little bit of zone control with the Leona and Orianna, but mostly poke, 3 out of 5, Jace, Nidalee, and the Varus. Although Varus has gone the on-hit build this game, so a little less poke, a little more DPS. Regardless, it's the same thing. For the Jace and Nidalee to be effective in these team fights, they have to land a decent amount of damage before the run-up to the fight in order to justify their picks, because otherwise their champions do less than the enemy champions. It doesn't make any sense to pick them. It's a classic draft concept. So right here, already their draft is kind of coming into place, and Blabber, I guess, I didn't really see the timing, but he throws spear and misses. All right, I can see whether he threw the spear before or after the ultimate. So it looks like it's relatively at the same time. He thought the guy might move forward. So this spear miss is acceptable because it makes sense, right? Mechanics are linked to logical decision making in the idea of like macro mechanics, where if you asked him why he threw the spear here with this cursor, it's obvious. He thought the Zoe would move forward rather than ulting. Okay, fine. Varus presses Q, doesn't see any target. He's not on hit Varus, or he is on hit Varus, I should say. So it doesn't do that much damage to begin with. And now you have the front line approaching from the right side. You have the Kai'Sa and Zoe approaching from the left. Blabber chooses to throw the spear at the tanks here, which is not only wrong on a macro level, he completely doesn't care about where his cursor is throwing it at these two characters. He has complete vision of them. He has vision through the minions and the pink ward. But look at the cursor placement that he's choosing to use. It's somewhere along this line, which makes absolutely no sense considering both enemy characters are along this line, and the Udyr and Alistar, regardless of not taking damage, the decision to throw it at them already is wrong rather than the Kai'Sa, because if he tags on the Kai'Sa, the fight's just won. It's like he wasn't even really paying attention to where he was throwing it. And this is not a thing that's happening in this team fight only. It happens in every pro game at every level that I've seen, every region, where players will just kind of be too lax in the discipline of their mechanics, where, especially in situations where it's supposed to matter. So right here, this is a max range JCQ. It's very similar to the concept of Karma RQ, where at a certain range, it's unmissable if they don't use a dash or something to dodge it, because of how big the blast radius is at the very end. You can't control the distance it travels, but if it's at the max range, it will do its full explosion, and it's fairly unmissable if you just put your cursor directly on them. So looking at the Kai'Sa here, she's at that effective range of the JCQ. And let's look at his cursor placement right here. So he placed it right like underneath him, which doesn't make any sense if you realize he's at the max range. If he just pointed directly at him and fired it, the Kaisa has to E to dodge it and really quickly, and he doesn't even make it that hard for her to do. Like if she E'd it, then it makes sense. But even then, Jace's EQ is pretty much the same as his ultimate in teamfights like this. And when I say it's ultimate, it's his most important ability set because it does the most damage and has the most impact right now. And he doesn't seem to put a lot of effort into throwing, if you know what I mean. Like, he doesn't recognize that he's at the max range, and he doesn't fire it directly at her, forcing her to E just to dodge it. Okay, and that kind of concludes the skill shot portion. They're playing a poke composition. Nidalee threw Spear at the tanks, Jace whiffed the EQ, and even though they hit the first EQ on the Zoe, both teams are basically about to team fight at full HP with a poke comp versus a semi-engaged composition. This is always going to be very difficult for the poke comp to win a straight up fight. Obviously, you have Orianna and Leona, which are more zone control champions, which will make this easier for them, but you get the idea. We have to really think about why the players miss the abilities they do and not just write it off as, oh, it was just unlucky, or, I was trolling, or an amalgamation of excuses that I've heard from many, many different players. You have to actually consider we can't be missing these abilities, especially in quote-unquote unmissable situations. Okay, so for the rest of this team fight, I just want to look at one person, and I feel bad for singling him out, but I feel like this is like unacceptable at this level to literally solo lose the game, not through game decision making, which is one thing where things can be murky, but in pure mechanics, which is what these players are supposed to be like quote unquote good at. You've got. All right, let's just look at Perkz' Orianna. So he basically doesn't play anything correctly, which is impressive because it's hard to do to not play any part of a fight correctly. So the first thing he does is the ball that he throws is not really... It's almost like a zone control ball that should have been out already if he's going to hold the ball in place to try and zone the back instead of using the Q cooldown now. It's not a ball placed to poke the front line coming at him. So immediately his first input is kind of questionable. But it's still okay. It still serves some purpose. The Flash Alistar engage comes in. He has Balls of Steel for not... He has Stopwatch, by the way, for not stopwatching or flashing this, but I guess he realizes that the enemy team doesn't have a lot of instant follow-up. It'd be very impressive if that was his decision-making. He didn't flash this consciously, because a lot of players would see this Flash Alistar combo and flash out of just pure instinct, because it's scary as hell. But he doesn't flash right here, and Kaisa comes in on the back, and this is really important. So being able to see what's happening on your screen and understanding what's going on, information gathering, helps you play fights correctly. So in this case, Perkz immediately kites out, and Q cooldown at this point is around 2.5 to 3 seconds. So I'm pretty sure it's coming up in 0.2, 0.3 seconds right now, after because he got comboed after the Q. So at this point, you know that the Kaisa just flashed over the right wall. That's the only place she could have gone. She has no ultimate. If we land ultimate Shockwave on the Kaisa, she's going to get hit by it, guaranteed. It's impossible to dodge. And right here, he walks all the way back, even though he's already out of threat of the enemy champions completely, if you can see that. And now he throws the ball late. Now, it is possible that the Q literally just was on cooldown. That's entirely possible. And he did E himself, which is understandable, instead of Nidalee, who's flashing on the Ori. And funnily enough, Blabber tried to punish this flash as fast as he could, but it just gets worse. So after this, Perkz moves forward. Blabber's under threat of sleep, so he has to zone them back, and he decides to QW the Udyr here. He once again still knows, by the way, that the Kaisa has no ultimate and no flash, and this is the easiest QR on the Kaisa I've ever seen in my life. She chooses not to do it, which I think this is a bigger mistake, especially considering I don't know his exact Q cooldown. It could have not been up when she initially flashed over the wall. I think it was, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay, and right here, he still has Stopwatch, Flash, and Ultimate. He sees the Zoe Q coming towards him, and right now he still knows that the Kaisa has no Flash. So right here, if he wanted to play this quote-unquote perfectly, he would just QR Zhonya's the damage, take no damage, and get the Shockwave off on the Kaisa. The fight is over. You can't cleanse the Shockwave. She's CC'd. She has nowhere to go. She's about to get one shot. You can also flash the damage here, seeing that the Zoe's ulting forward, seeing that you're the target, seeing you're being hit. You can just flash to the left to dodge the Zoe Q, and then QR. That's the same thing. But he chooses none of them. And this is not like the Jensen thing where he had Echo ult and he just goes and gets CC'd and died and just doesn't press R or whatever. This is just purely him not pressing any of his buttons. It's almost as if he was overwhelmed by the amount of things happening in front of him and couldn't process what was happening fast enough and just died. I can't tell you like what happened to Perkz here. Like, he's a really good player, you know, world class, unironically one of the best mid laners in the world. So we have to actually question, like, it would be almost normal to assume that he's sick, or that like there was something compromising his mental at the time, just because this is so insanely out of character for that level of player. But at the same time, we do have to address just mechanical misplays as a whole instead of ignoring them, because I think just looking at macro and just looking at draft and decision making is not enough when your players play fights like this. And this is not something new. I've seen this at the amateur level all the way up to the pro level all the time. And that's why I do a lot of mechanics coaching, where a lot of players go, why are we doing focus on mechanics? Just to make sure that no one ever plays a fight like this under me. That's kind of the idea. So, thanks for watching. We might be doing more of these in the future, but essentially the TLDR of the video is mechanics matter, and they change the game just as much as macro does in a lot of cases, and having a baseline level of micro, baseline level of mechanics, expected amounts of input you're supposed to play in a fight, this should not be acceptable for the professional level. It just should never be. This should be the number one clip of the entire like day to show what the hell was Perkz doing. All right, see you next time.